as it has been increasingly difficult to navigate the space encompassing theater hall screenings this decade without encountering the inevitable comic book adaptation brought to life, all nicely packaged with tons of special effects and other technical gadgetry waiting to cinematically envelop the young adult. I thought I would make a video detailing the difficulties arising from this type of adaptation. Now, at first glance, it's easy to understand the underlying motivation of the filmmakers in question in terms of wanting to max out the same both evocative and maximalist action scenes which comics hold so dear, but it becomes a more difficult question to ask if it's really feasible to make this adaptation come to life through the art and manipulations of the digital screen. In this video, therefore, which I consider an addendum of sorts to my previous film adaptation video, links are to be found in the description, I want to tackle this very question, where I will conclude in the end that these types of adaptations are particularly difficult to execute well. Now let's get started. On the surface level, all seems well in many aspects, such as the medium providing ample material in terms of free storyboards, as well as offering up an abundance of dialogue which can be readily placed within any film adaptation. However, as we begin to essentialize the different mediums a little bit, I have here chosen to place film within the confines of that of moving pictures, where time, or in film terms duration, becomes the essential element chosen to be freely manipulated, creating different tapestries of space, whereby comics is composed of that of individual frames, or in comic terms, panels. The problem then arises, in my opinion, of trying to conceptualize the cinematic frame in terms of frames borrowed from that of comics, where these frames serve as storyboards for the film, but as I will argue, the viewer's perception and relation to time are divergent between the two mediums. In simplified terms, we can say that when the viewer's gaze is placed among panels, you are most likely taking in the frames in a one-to-one fashion, where you are free to divert attention back to previous frames however often you like on a page. Whereas the unfolding of events of the film occur in a near instantaneous fashion, which is directly tied with that of the film's frame rate in question. What is served with film then is a multiplicity of images, where both motion and movements are being transpired from one image onto the next, where the images in question are again related to each other for the external observer. This very difference is in fact also directly commented upon by the legendary comic book author Alan Moore in relation to his magnus opus, Watchmen, where he intentionally encouraged the reader to study that of previous individual frames in order to better work out new details in terms of the storyline and world building contained within the comic universe. This working method of the instilling of rhythm in terms of absorbment of the comic page then becomes impossible, in my opinion, to transfer with full fidelity to that of the moving images, thus creating a sense of estrangement for the viewers. It is thus when we pause a single frame, having been previously transferred from that of the comic book or graphic novel medium, that one discovers that one cannot replicate the same richness of texture as that of its origin. This can again be attributed to the fact that the film scene in question has been set up to serve that of dynamicism of real-life motion and events, transmitting the artistic intentionality of its inhabited filmmakers, while the single frame of the comic gives the artistic imitation of action and movement, and its conveyance of a potentialization of a different but related language medium. A second objection or intrinsic challenge for these adaptations relates to the comic book illustrations themselves, in opposition to the real-life portrayal seen on screen. Comic books and graphic novels, like that of cartoons, are in general prone to be much more violent than that of its real-life counterpart, which might be especially true if we consider cartoons and animes aimed at an older audience. A large part of this phenomena, I then claim, can be directly tied to that of the works of comics operating within an added layer of abstraction, where because one is working with illustrations, either drawn or digital, the viewer then becomes seemingly more removed from the reality representations of violence. Along these same lines of thinking, violence can also be easily tied in with that of a comedic effect, as one abstracts away real-life associations and consequences of violence due to the fictitious inhabitation of its characters, which are actualized through means which we have already accepted as being constructed as entirely fake on the surface level. The film medium then manipulates reality with cameras as its aid, creating either a simulation or simulacra of reality, while comic books and graphic novels have to a much greater degree already been rendered fake beforehand by the reader in question, who is instead willfully working through the levels of added abstraction. This is again no new form of illusion creation, where we can trace back much earlier origins to that of the ancient cave dwellers' earliest pictorial representations. I have also found at least some empirical support for this thesis, where of course I would need to delve much deeper into the literature to find out how well it holds up. However, among interesting examples, I here briefly mention that of two studies which are linked in a paper I have posted in the description, which finds that, quote, violence depicted in humorous cartoons is perceived as less violent than that of the same behavior enacted by live actors. This misattribution of violence would be a very interesting topic for that of neuroscience to tackle as well, where one might hypothesize that there would exist a priming in which thoughts and emotions are being activated in memory, which in turn gets confused between that of the humorous and that of the violent when rendering cartoons, comics, and graphic novels. In any case, the point I want to make here is that the violence between that of comic books and real-life movie dramatizations are fundamentally different, which makes the job of adaptation especially difficult when working with these types of adaptations. In fact, it's not just the violence depictions, but also that of the suspension of the laws of physics, which so frequently occur in real-life adaptations. Superheroes which are seemingly seen suspended in midair with little to no air resistance, and which seemingly are able to absorb an infinite amount of damage, be it in the resistance when falling to the ground or by taking a pounding from an enemy, just don't convey the same degree of verisimilitude as when seen in the comic medium representation themselves. As I have argued for earlier in the video, the added layer of abstraction and suspension of belief, which is, I claim, inherent to that of comic books and graphic novels, does little if anything in terms of transferring into the real-life movie adaptations themselves. It is also for this reason, along with other reasons such as the depiction of violence, as to why I in general prefer the animated cartoon and anime mediums in terms of making successful adaptations for this type of material. To name an example here, the DC animated movies and series would serve as a prime example here, along with the voluminous output of anime stemming from Japan. There is also in existence, I must add, a pedigree of this type of arguments being put forth, where I might cite as an example the famed director Terry Gilliam, who I was happy to learn gives the same exact argument in terms of the Marvel movie franchise's failure when enacting ludicrous physics, as seen in plentiful abundance during their array of action sequences. To sum up this video then, we have looked at three main arguments in terms of the difficulty in making comic book and graphic novel adaptations, which I summarize as number 1, the failure of fidelity transformations in terms of turning comic panels into that of one-to-one correspondences with that of movie storyboards. Number 2, the failure in relating violence as it is portrayed through the medium, which I claim is fundamentally different. And lastly, number 3, the general failure of conveying the same suspension of belief in terms of the breakage of physical laws. I will here lastly reiterate that I don't take the position that these adaptations should not be made in terms of live-action dramatizations, but the main takeaway is rather that of the difficulties which lie in these adaptations, in which I claim are harder to make than that of fiction, novel, and short books adaptations, which I addressed in the previous video. I will also state here lastly that I don't hold the view that some do in terms of films being comics before they are turned into films in the storyboard phase, as I claim what is fundamental for the filmmaker is that of constructing images in motion throughout the dilation of time, while comic book artists, on the other hand, have always placed their emphasis firmly in that of the richness of individual panels and their further manipulations.